Hello and welcome to this Guardian live event. I'm Devika Bhatt, Deputy Head of International News at The Guardian. Over one astonishing weekend last month, Vladimir Putin faced the greatest threat to his power since he took over in 1999. Yevgeny Prigozhin, leader of the Wagner group and once a key ally of the president, led a rebellion against the military and marched on Moscow. For several hours, it seemed that Russia might even be on the brink of a civil war. The rebellion ended just as suddenly as it began, but it leaves many questions unanswered. And tonight, we're going to be trying to address some of those, talking about the aftermath of the mutiny and what its consequences might be for Russia and for the war in Ukraine. Now, let me welcome tonight's panel. First, we have Piotr Sawyer, Russia Affairs correspondent for The Guardian. Next, we have Irina Borogon. Irina is a Russian investigative journalist. She is co-founder and deputy editor of Agentura.ru, a watchdog of the Russian Secret Service activities. With her co-author, Andrei Soldatov, she has written books about the history of surveillance technologies in Russia and about the legacy of the KGB. And finally, we have Luke Harding, senior international correspondent for The Guardian and author of Invasion, a frontline account of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. He is also a former Moscow correspondent. Now, before I ask my first question, we will be talking for around 40 minutes, but we do want to hear from you too. So do send us your questions via the Q&A button, and we'll try to answer as many of those as we can in the time that we have in the last section of the event. And if you like, feel free to include your name and where you're joining us from. So, Irina, if I can start with you, please. This series of extraordinary events in Russia, beginning with the mutiny by Prigozhin, stopped in its tracks with this very uneasy, precarious truce, which was brokered by the Belarusian president and under which Prigozhin was granted passage to Belarus. Then a few days later, it was said that Prigozhin was back in Russia, in St. Petersburg. And then just yesterday, we heard that from the Kremlin, that Prigozhin had been sitting down with Putin just 5 days after the aborted rebellion. So can I ask you, how did we get here to this position and where are we now in terms of the state of play of things?
To be honest, what happened was really surprising even to me, given the fact that I always in this stuff and on news people and how crazy they are. But Prigozhin's mutiny was really, really surprising and even shocking because he did exactly what Putin afraid for many, many years. Putin built up his security apparatus in order to prevent any kind of coup d'etat. That was not coup d'etat, but it was a real mutiny. And Putin's security apparatus has been fighting with dissidents, with people who are protesting on the streets, with businessmen who have another point of view, and with all people who are just different, who have a point of view different from the Kremlin. And we have hundreds of people, thousands of people in prison for expressing their opinion on social media, and despite all these security apparatus, despite 300,000 of troops, which is possessed by Rosgvardia, which is Putin's national guard, despite all this, all forces which were given to the FSB for these years, and even the huge army, despite all these things, Putin got a real mutiny, and his authority was a little bit shaken for the first time for the 23 years. So how it happened, and why this was Prigozhin who did this. It happened because Putin's hierarchy did not suppose that a person who was appointed by him on all this position, who was just created by him personally, could be able to fight against Putin personally. But it was not, to be honest, it was not the fight. It was not a coup d'etat. It was not the fight against Putin, but it was a real a real fight against the Ministry of Defense and against the Chief of General Staff, which is a systemic part of Putin's system, extraordinarily important during the time of the war.
Thank you, Irina. And actually, can I draw you on that point, Piotr, that Irina just made about this, being a kind of long-running feud that dates back to, months now, really, between the Ministry of Defense, led by Sergei Shoigu, versus Yevgeny Prigozhin. Can you tell us about how that sort of fed into where we got to now? And also, you've done some very good reporting on the mood in Moscow on the day that this happened, that very dramatic weekend. So it would be great to hear from you on that.
Yeah, so this feud was going on for months, really ever since Wagner joined Russia in the fight in Ukraine, which didn't happen right away, but by April, May of 2022, Wagner's fighters were already in Ukraine fighting. And, there was this long-standing argument between Prigozhin and Shoigu. Prigozhin was complaining that he wasn't getting enough ammunition from the Ministry of Defense. He was claiming that the Ministry of Defense was corrupt. He was really, pushing these sort of populist ideas that he is the man who fights the Russian elite, but also the elite within the Ministry of Defense. Shoigu is not a military guy himself. He comes from a Ministry of Emergency background. He never fought in the army. So he's sort of not extremely popular in the Russian army, and Prigozhin knows this very well. So, he was actually getting some sympathies from within the Russian army for his criticism. But for a long time, we thought that sort of Putin, was above this criticism, and he was, because Prigozhin never personally attacked Putin. He would never go there. And we thought that, Putin in his classical style would allow these different types of elites to fight against each other. It seemed like he had this battle under control until the mutiny happened. And it really showed that Putin, wasn't the master of playing different fractions against each other as many thought he was for a long time, because that's sort of one of the ways his regime was always worked, that he sort of let the people below him sort of fight for his favors. But when we saw that Prigozhin started his mutiny, he even said, Putin is wrong, and this is the first time he spoke against him. And to get back to your point about the mood in Moscow, the many officials I talked to, and I know Irina is very well sourced as well. The people I talked to were very surprised about this mutiny. In Moscow, there was real panic, especially amongst sort of the people in the know. People were trying to leave the city, trying to escape. They didn't know if Moscow would fall. That just shows the real fear. And I talked to a lot of wealthy oligarchs and businessmen in Rublyovka, which is sort of this survey of Russia. And they were terrified, because Prigozhin always rages on against Rublyovka and against the elites. So they told me, we're scared of this man. We don't want him to come to our houses and burn our cars. So I think the mood was pretty terrified. Not maybe amongst all Muscovites. Many just went along and they looked at it as a spectacle. But I think amongst the officials and the elites, there was a real shock. And I think that shock really stayed for a few days afterwards, like a long hangover. And I think the trust in the system has taken a big hit among the elites.
Thank you, Piotr. Luke, turning back to Prigozhin himself, we know that Putin doesn't forgive opposition or enemies easily, and people have faced stiff jail terms or worse for much lesser alleged crimes than an uprising, an open mutiny against the government and marching to Moscow. Why has this not happened with Prigozhin? And could you tell us a bit about Prigozhin himself? He's had a really remarkable kind of rise and I guess fall now, hasn't he?
Well, has he? That seems to question whether he has fallen or is still very much in play. But Dmytro, you're right. The Prigozhin backstory is like something out of Dostoevsky, but actually a little bit crazier, because essentially he's a sort of gangster. There are two I mean, Irina has written very well about this, but there are sort of two main groups around Putin, speaking in very kind of crude terms. One is the Siloviki, the kind of intelligence power guys from the KGB and the security service. And the other are the kind of the bandits. And Prigozhin was very definitely a kind of bandit and a crook. And he spent 8 years in jail in the late Soviet Union in the 1980s for mugging women for their earrings, housebreaking, stealing, theft, and so on. So he was basically a kind of petty criminal. Then the Soviet Union collapsed. Then he goes to Leningrad and becomes Leningrad's first seller of hot dogs. He goes into catering, that's his niche. And then really allied with kind of the St. Petersburg mafia, he goes into kind of expensive, fancy restaurants, buys a barge, floats it on the river, and his customers are Russian politicians and Russian gangsters who've quite often turned out to be the same people. And who's an advisor to the mayor, Sobchak, and Putin and Prigozhin, they kind of hit it off. And you know, the version I've heard is that Prigozhin is a very good storyteller. I mean, he's quite entertaining. I mean, he's a rather charismatic person. Also, I would say completely psychopathic. And he becomes an oligarch. By the time Putin is in the Kremlin, he's got catering contracts. His business Concord is selling millions of meals to the Russian army, and he becomes a kind of go-to man for the Kremlin when they want to do secret stuff that they wish to outsource, so that their fingerprints are not on it. So Prigozhin sets up famously the troll factory in St. Petersburg that I would say have left, over the past decade and a half, probably tens of thousands of comments on Guardian articles, most of them not very kind. And of course, the trolls and Prigozhin tried to, in 2016, to influence the US presidential election and help Donald Trump win. So he was a sort of super fixer. And then, of course, he developed his own mercenary army, Wagner. Now, we're all talking about Wagner, but for a long time, Prigozhin said Wagner didn't exist. He said it was a fiction, that we were all idiots. He even tried to sue Elliot Higgins, the founder of Bellingcat, who wrote about Wagner. But the reality is that Wagner sent mercenaries to Syria, to the Central African Republic.
Oh, I think we may have lost Luke, possibly. Luke is in Kyiv, where the connection might be bad. Let's let's stick on the same theme. Hopefully we'll have Luke back with us any second now. Piotr, so yeah. I mean, what now for Prigozhin? I mean, there's this whole question about where he actually might be. Sorry,
yeah.
Problems. So Piotr, let me jump to you. What now for Prigozhin? Do we think, to Luke's point, can he come back into the fold, or is he done for?
We're in this really fascinating place right now with Prigozhin. Obviously, the day after he started his mutiny, Putin called him a traitor. He vowed to liquidate Prigozhin and Wagner. He was using very strong emotional language. By the evening, he made that deal with brokered by Lukashenko, which allowed Prigozhin to leave the country in exile, as so we thought. A few days later, Lukashenko confirmed supposedly that Prigozhin was in Belarus, and he followed the deal. But since then, we've seen Prigozhin's jet going in and out of Belarus, flying to St. Petersburg, to Moscow. Then yesterday, the Kremlin confirmed earlier media reports that they sat down with Prigozhin and 35 other commanders. So there's this really interesting situation where it doesn't feel like Prigozhin is worried for his safety in Russia. He seems to be moving around relatively freely. At the same time, we're seeing this organized media campaign against Prigozhin, trying to discredit him, where state TV is framing him as this corrupt businessman. They showed images of a search of his house, showing all these, showing that he had gold plates in his house, opulent mansion, even drugs. So there's a campaign to discredit him. So it seems like the Kremlin, wants to really destroy Prigozhin as a politician, to make sure that he has no place in the Russian political system. But they're not exactly sure what to do with Prigozhin, the businessman, and his massive legacy. Over 3 decades, he built this massive empire that it's Wagner, but it's also his media company. It's also his catering, which caters schools across the country, and also the army and lots of army bases. So I think the Kremlin is realizing that it's not that easy to get rid of this massive empire that he created, and we're still seeing that they're trying to figure out what to do next with Prigozhin.
And can I ask you, and also Irina, maybe Piotr, you could address this first. What now for the Wagner group? Because under the terms of this truce, they're supposed to either go to Belarus, aren't they, or sign these contracts which would subsume them into the regular army. But by all accounts, we're still seeing a presence of Wagner troops in eastern Ukraine.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Obviously, one of the reasons this whole conflict started between Prigozhin and the Ministry of Defense was because the Ministry of Defense ordered all Russian irregular soldiers to sign a contract with the regular army, and Putin backed that decision. And that was one of the reasons why Prigozhin started his revolt in the first place. Since then, Putin doubled down on this after the revolt, saying that all Wagner soldiers had the choice either to sign the contract or leave to Belarus. But the deadline was supposed to be 1st of July. But I've been talking to some of the sources on the ground, and it seems like most of the soldiers, and this is between 10 and 15,000 Wagner soldiers, are still in eastern Ukraine, are still at their camps. They're still armed. So this presented a very interesting situation. Belarus has been saying that we welcome them, and they've been building some sort of camps. But is it really a viable solution for 15,000 men to transfer to Belarus? I'm not so sure. I'm also not sure how many Wagner soldiers would join the regular army, because many of them despise Shoigu, like Prigozhin. They see Prigozhin as their sort of cult hero, and they don't want to fight under the Ministry of Defense. So I think it's definitely a very difficult question that the Kremlin is gripping with. But I'm also very curious to hear what Irina thinks about this.
Yes, Irina, please do go ahead and tell us what your view is on.
Sorry. As far as I know, Prigozhin's people, they're still waiting for the result of his negotiations with the Kremlin, because not a lot of Wagner's troops went to Belarus, and not a lot of them want to join the Russian army, because they're not the way for these people. So they want their money, they want their power, they want to be independent, and that's not what you're going to do with the Russian army. So Prigozhin raised the stakes when he organized his mutiny, and he lost a little bit, but he didn't lose the battle completely, because Prigozhin has a huge a huge international capacity, because Prigozhin's mercenaries, they're in charge of, they serve as a personal guards for the government of several African countries. And it is very important for the Kremlin. This is important for Putin personally, and this is important for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And otherwise, these African leaders in Mali and the Central African Republic, they will be who are afraid of what's going on in their country, don't have any other reliable protection. If they lost Prigozhin's people, if they lost Wagner's troop, they found out themselves in a very, very vulnerable situation. And so this is also a leverage for Prigozhin. So he has a lot of a lot of resources how to impact on the situation. So I think he will show us how capable he is still. I don't believe that he will be downplayed to some extent, but he will not be expelled from the system completely, and he will not be punished properly, at least not now.
Thank you, Irina. And following on from that, Irina, what do we know now about what might be going on inside the Kremlin? There've always been these very precarious relationships at work, people who are close to Putin at one point and then perhaps not so close to him, loyalists who then become sort of enemies. But who is close to him now, and how do we think that dynamic is playing out in this incredibly difficult time, this sort of, these few weeks just after this mutiny?
As far as I know, the Russian elites, the Russian bureaucratic elites, as well as the security services, they got frightened at what happened a week ago, and they always have been frightened by what Prigozhin's were doing, because he broken a lot of rules. He even by Russian standards, he demonstrated crazy violence, even by their rules. So, but he got his position because Putin needed him, and Prigozhin solved Putin's problem many times quite effectively. And he won Bakhmut. He was very handful in Africa, and also he was very useful to downplay Gerasimov and Shoigu when they when they start losing the war. So let's see what happened. But I think that the Russian bureaucratic elite, they are not in a position to fight against Prigozhin, because they are frightened to death by Putin personally, by his rules, and they will be waiting for the results. And I think that nobody can now influence on Putin, because he created a crazy system which is ruled by him personally. And that's why this system demonstrated us its weakness during the Prigozhin's mutiny, because Putin has now, because when you are the top leader and don't have you don't have a real accountability of your people, you have to do everything by your own, which is kind of impossible task in the time of crisis. You can do this during a peaceful time, but not in the time of crisis.
Thank you. Yes, that's a really interesting point there. And we will go, you mentioned there Bakhmut, and we will get onto the kind of what we think the repercussions of this are for the for within Ukraine and the counteroffensive. But before we do that, I just wanted to ask Luke, Lukashenko, played this sort of somewhat bizarre and kind of almost pivotal role in this whole thing, brokering this deal, becoming the kind of conduit for information, albeit a rather confusing one, sort of giving this very long and rambling speech and statements. What do you make of his role?
Yeah, it is very bizarre. I mean, no one saw that coming. I mean, none of us really quite saw the coup. We could see the visible public tensions between Prigozhin and Shoigu, but Lukashenko, I think, was kind of enhanced by what happened last month, and suddenly popped up saying that he kind of brokered peace.
I think we might have unfortunately just lost Luke again. This is one of the, it's obviously wonderful to have Luke with us tonight, but the connection can be a bit sketchy from Kyiv for sort of obvious reasons. So hopefully we'll get him back again any second. But until we do that, maybe I could divert that same question to you, Piotr, on Lukashenko.
Yeah, it does seem that Lukashenko is the only winner really from this incident. Lukashenko himself said there are no heroes here. Prigozhin wasn't a hero, Putin wasn't a hero, but Lukashenko did get some clout within Russia. And Lukashenko's relation with Putin is complicated. It's hard to call them friends. I think people usually use the term frenemies. Because they have this, they know each other for so long, but there's always a little bit of tension between them. And we saw some of that tension come out when Lukashenko described in detail how he was the one who actually prevented Putin from, going berserk and wiping Prigozhin out. So, there was Lukashenko really enjoyed the spotlight. Luke, are you back? Yeah. So Lukashenko really loved being in the spotlight, of course. And there's this whole new dimension with Russia handing over non-tactical nuclear weapons to Belarus, which should further sort of give him stability and some sort of leverage in this situation. But yeah, as I said, I think Lukashenko is the only one who could come out of this in the more positive light. The big question is, will Wagner soldiers actually move to Belarus, and under which conditions? It's hard to imagine that Lukashenko could pay for them the way Russia paid for the Wagner soldiers, because in the end, Wagner was sustained by the Russian government. So I think there's something to look out for next, where the Wagner soldiers will go.
Thanks, Piotr. Luke, I think we've got you back again. So let's actually, I think between you and Piotr, we got a very good sort of complete answer to the question about Lukashenko and the kind of very sort of tricky relationship he has with Moscow. So maybe we can move on to the Ukrainian perspective now. Obviously, you are in Kyiv. You've been there for a little while now and have a very good insight into the sort of latest there. So what is Ukraine, what is Kyiv, what is the leadership and the military leadership made of events in Russia, these very dramatic events?
Yeah, and first of all, just Davika, everyone watching, apologies, I'm in Kiev and it's a slightly unpredictable environment. We've had 3 air raid alarms today. I mean, unfortunately, explosions so far, but the internet seems to be rather erratic. But just to answer your question, I mean, I was here that weekend, and actually the mood among Ukrainians was one of glee. They were following everything happening inside Russia minute by minute. There were lots of memes on social media about getting the popcorn out, and I think the hope was that this mutiny would roll on for a few days, that Prigozhin would go to Moscow, and that this disarray inside the Russian elite, this feuding between Shoigu, Prigozhin, would actually demoralize Russian soldiers on the battlefield and present some kind of military opportunities for Ukraine. And the context is that Ukraine's armed forces began this large, long-anticipated counteroffensive last month at the beginning of June, and the reality is it's been tough going. They've made very kind of slow progress, and the problem is they're facing massive Russian fortifications, they're facing minefields, and they're facing a Russian army that, for all of its just sort of internal unhappiness, is still very strong, very powerful, and has superiority in terms of tanks, in terms of artillery, and most crucially, aviation. It's got helicopters, it's got planes. And so, of course, when Prigozhin's people shot down several helicopters and a warplane over Russia, there was jubilation here. I think so we think about 13 Russian pilots were killed, and just for a moment it looked like the whole balance of initiative in the war was changing, and then perhaps Ukraine could break through Russian defenses and move forward. Now that hasn't happened, and people I talk to here are still cautiously optimistic that it will happen. They say that Ukraine is still pushing, testing, knocking out Russian heavy weapons, particularly anti-air defenses, and they're optimistic that perhaps in August they'll get this long-awaited breakthrough. But clearly, the worse things are in Moscow, the better things are in Kiev. And I think with Prigozhin still in play, there's a lot of unpredictability in a system that previously had seemed very strong and very stable. That was the kind of watchword of the Putin regime, and now turns out to be rather brittle and chaotic.
Thank you, Luke. And sticking with the point about the sort of Russian efforts in Ukraine and how that is going, Irina, you've written about how, actually possibly one of the impetus is here from Prigozhin's point of view is that there may be a sense now that Wagner is in Ukraine is not as important as people may have once believed, or that Prigozhin would like people to believe. It would be interesting to hear more from you on that particular question, because that's a really interesting one, isn't it?
You know, Prigozhin came from criminal background. He's a former gangster, so he can brilliantly use his strong side. And when he eventually captured Bakhmut, it was a long-awaited victory for Russians. I mean, strategically, it may be not such a big deal, but for the Russian army, which was stuck on this point and could not move ahead, it was a real success. And Prigozhin exaggerated this success, like I don't know, 1 million times. He spread a lot of propaganda information via his trolls, his supporters, his media in Russia, and it was the Russians and the Russian army got the idea that Prigozhin's Wagner is strong. It is a real capable and strong army unit, but it is to some extent, but it's not comparable with the Russian army, which is make of 1 million people. And as far as we know, the Prigozhin's Wagner is 15-20 made of 15-20,000 people. So, but fighting in Bakhmut, Prigozhin gave the Russian army a lot of time to prepare for the Ukrainian counter-offensive, and that was Prigozhin's advantage. That's why Prigozhin felt himself very, very proud and very important. But when the Ukrainian counter-offensive started, and it became clear that it is progressed kind of slowly, Prigozhin's importance started getting less and less, and it became visible that Russian army can survive without Wagner. So I don't think that that right now Wagner and its mercenaries can affect on the battlefield heavily. So I don't think they can play a huge role at the battlefield. So because Russian army is still doing quite normally, and that was the idea that Shoigu also got, and that's why he decided to reinitiate his relationship with Wagner and try to expel Wagner from the battlefield. So that's why we got this mutiny.
Thank you. That's a very good explanation there. Piotr, what the question I asked to Luke, what's the perception in Moscow of how things are going in Ukraine and how the mission is going there? And it would, I mean, there's obviously the view from the Kremlin about this, and what the Kremlin is sort of thinking about this, which I know is to draw on a question of what the Russian public is making of the war effort.
Well, I think it's very important to remember, and I think it's easy for us in the West to forget that the majority of Russian public does not follow the war very much. The way the Putin has set up the system for years is try to make Russians as apolitical as possible, to really let them just live their own lives and let Putin rule the country. So if you look at opinion polls, majority of Russians don't know what's going on the battlefield very much. Of course, events like a full mobilization completely changes that dynamic when people are actually actively forced to go in and fight. That's why the Russian government is so scared of announcing another mobilization. They've announced one; they will have to announce another one at some point because they just need forces. but they're scared of these sort of events that can really trigger public unrest. During the first mobilization, we saw some limited protests in the south of Russia, but we saw mass immigration. So Russians really showed with their feet that they're leaving. But then events like the Prigozhin mutiny, that's another event where people actually do realize what's going on. So yeah, it's a hard question. I think obviously within the elites, the mood is somber. They're really they see this war isn't going anywhere. But it's been somber for months now. I think Prigozhin's mutiny was another nightmare event for them. The majority of average Russians, they don't follow the war as actively as I mentioned. At the same time, Prigozhin, if you look at opinion polls before the mutiny, he was polling quite well. In the sort of top 5 most recognized people in the country. Through the Bakhmut really helped him gain this public status. He was aired a lot on Russian TV. After the revolt, he lost a lot of popularity, but according to some polls, I mean, it's very hard to trust polls in a authoritarian country, but according to some polls, he still has sympathy, enjoys sympathy of among 30% of the Russians, which is a pretty significant number for a man that almost started a civil war. And we've seen some of those sympathies come out in Rostov, in the city in the south of Russia that Prigozhin captured. I think, of course, it would be silly to say that Prigozhin has the popularity of all of Russia, or that he could lead he'd be more popular Putin or anything like this, but he does enjoy, still continues to enjoy some sympathies, despite the Russian media trying to destroy him, and especially among the sort of the more rural populist people, he's seen as this man who fights the elites, who fights Shoigu, who's extremely unpopular. So I think that I think to answer your first question about how Russians are looking, it really depends who you ask. But interesting enough, the majority of Russians try not to follow the war. They just try to live their daily lives as much as possible.
Thanks, Piotr. Luke, please do weigh in.
If I don't glitch, I just wanted to say, I mean, the thing about Prigozhin, I wrote a big piece, a sort of read on the weekend of his mutiny, is that he's just extraordinarily charismatic. And what Piotr was saying about his language resonating with ordinary Russians is absolutely true. I mean, he records these lengthy videos where he just rages and vents at Shoigu, and they're actually kind of darkly funny and scathing, but also very witty. I mean, he called Gerasimov a squealing fishwife. He's sitting there with his Wagner banner and his cup of tea. And I think just one of the most significant moments, actually, just before his coup, was when he denounced the reasons for what Russia calls the special military operation. He said it was nothing to do with demilitarizing Ukraine or denazifying it, which were the official reasons from the Kremlin. He said it was all to do with the vanity and ambition of Sergei Shoigu, who wanted another medal on his chest. And in a way, the fact that he has been very popular and he got this kind of rapturous rock star send-off when he left Rostov-on-Don and when he disappeared off into the night. I do think that's a problem for Putin, because Putin, by contrast, looks grey, old, weak, hesitant, absent. I mean, Prigozhin, he's the guy on the front line with the thump of battle all around. And it seems to me that he is something of a pretender. I mean, there may be a kind of truce for now, but you can sort of somehow see him in a presidential role in some alternative post-Putin world if we ever get to that.
Yeah, and I think that is why the Russian media, at least the government through the media, is spending so much time trying to discredit him. This popular propagandist Solovyov had this show. He said, Prigozhin is no Robin Hood. He's actually a thief himself. Really going against the one thing that Prigozhin says the others are, which are corrupt. They're really trying to break this image of Prigozhin as a man of the people, because they're feeling worried about his standing. So I think, for them, for now, one of the main goals is to destroy Prigozhin the politician, and the Prigozhin the businessman. They're not so sure yet what to do with that.
Thanks both. Irina, what about the security service apparatus in Russia? I mean, it's a very big network led by the FSB. And it seems, as we were saying earlier, that they were sort of caught unaware, basically, by this attempted mutiny. So do we think there's fallout there within the security service? And do we think changes are likely to be afoot as a result of, this sort of failure to envisage this happening?
It was a huge failure of the security services of Russia, and they didn't do anything. They do nothing, literally nothing. And even in Rostov-on-Don, where we have local branch of the FSB, which is the main security service of Russia, and even in Rostov-on-Don, people didn't do anything. The FSB officers, they just barricaded themselves inside the building and didn't show up outside. They didn't go out the streets. They didn't do anything. And it reminds us the situation in 1991 that when the real coup d'etat organized by the KGB happened, and a crowd of protesters, they just toppled the monument to the Felix Dzerzhinsky, who was a founder of the predecessors of the KGB, in front of the building of the main headquarters of the KGB. And no KGB officers was brave enough to appear on the square and to protect its founder. So back then, they decided, the KGB officers, or the old KGB decided, except their leaders, decided not to participate in the coup d'etat and not to be involved in the events when the part of the authority, when the fight it was going on between the different branch of the authorities, between the different part of the power. So and this happened again. So when the Russian security services see that the battle is going on inside within the Kremlin, the battle is going on between Putin's friends and Putin's appointees, they try to keep distance from what's going on. Because why? Because they're afraid to be put in a position for people who can be blamed after everything will be settled. And to some extent, of course, it's a very shameful behavior of the security services, and it's very shameful from the Kremlin's point of view and from the Putin's point of view. And of course, it is very shameful behavior of the Rosguardia, which is the National Guard. But to some extent, they were right, because we know now that Putin, that Prigozhin got away from the situation, and he survived. So, but the security services can be those people who became the people to put blame on them. So, I mean, that's amazing. Unbelievable.
Yeah, absolutely. In that context you just outlined, it makes it all the more unbelievable, really, doesn't it? Just a reminder that we would love to hear from you and get your questions. So if you would like to put a question or comment forward at any point, please use the Q&A button, and do include your name if you'd like us to read it out. So I will begin. We have got some great questions coming in already. So Oliver asks, would Wagner regrouping in Belarus a new threat to Kyiv? Luke, perhaps you could answer that. What are your thoughts on that one?
Vika, I'm sorry, I missed the middle of the question. I just got the beginning and the end, but not the verb. Can you tell me again?
Okay, the crucial bit. Okay, so the question is, would Wagner regrouping in Belarus be a new threat to Kyiv? Okay,
yeah, thank you. I think no, actually. I mean, I think the kind of the northern attack which is what we had. I mean, I was in Kiev on February the 24th last year when it all began, where there were Russian tanks trundling across the Belarus border through Chernobyl and getting as far as the Kiev region and about probably 20 miles away, 15 miles away from where I am at the moment. I don't think Kiev thinks that that's going to repeat. I think that's not the scenario. They think the front line, which is currently about 600 miles, is pretty fixed. It's the east, it's the south, and the south is where Ukraine has to make gains if it's going to kick the Russians out and to make any kind of military progress this summer. So it's a sort of, you can sort of see the threat, but as Piotr was saying earlier, actually it's unclear how many Wagner troops will go to Belarus, and I think the bigger threat is almost to the Belarusian.
Thank you, Luke. I think we lost the tail end of that answer, but we got most of it, so that was great. So a question from Charles Lewson in Bristol. How is it that Russia sustains, tolerates, or desires an independent army?
Well, for years, Putin really needed Wagner. Wagner started in 2014 during Russia's first invasion of Ukraine. The way sources in the Ministry of Defense told me the story of the creation of Wagner was Prigozhin came and pitched the idea himself to Putin and to the Ministry of Defense. Russia needed an army in Ukraine because they were denying that they were invading the country. So then Prigozhin, it started when there were in 2014-15, lots of smaller private military companies were started just for this reason, because Russia needed this plausible deniability in Ukraine to have people on the ground, but without actually claiming that they have people on the ground. And from there they used Wagner in Syria very effectively, used them in various African countries. For a long time, it really served Putin's purpose to have this shadowy army that they could just say it's not us. And it's not just Wagner, of course, it's also the troll farms in the US elections and lots of other information operations that Wagner and Prigozhin had in Africa. So for years, this was for Putin, in Putin's mind, a perfect setup to have these people he thought he could trust. He thought they were completely loyal to him, working in under his system. I think in the end, he underestimated Prigozhin. He underestimated his own power. It turned out the way it turned out, where he had Prigozhin and Wagner marching onto Moscow. I don't think he ever expected this scenario when he agreed to starting Wagner in 2014.
Thanks, Piotr. Irina, I'm going to direct the next question to you. So David asks, was the reaction to Wagner in Rostov representative of Russian local opinion? Rostov is obviously the city that the Wagner Group did manage to effectively capture before it marched on to Moscow.
To be honest, we don't know what the public really thinks, because what we saw on videos was like a small crowd of people, like maybe hundreds of people, who were very cheerful to see Wagner's mercenaries, and they greeted them. They took photos near the tanks, and on the tanks they look like they are very, very happy with what's going on and with Wagner's mercenaries. But I don't think that it is really reflects the real situation, because most of people stayed home because they were frightened. They got scared, so they didn't go out on the streets. I think that for average people, for normal people, for people who live their daily lives, Prigozhin and his mercenaries is a nightmare, because it's extreme violence, and they always demonstrated this. But for some people, I mean, it's for some people okay with this, even very happy with such kind of people.
Thanks, Irina. That touches on a broader point that I think would be really interesting for our audience. We have had a few questions on this theme, so I will ask it to maybe Luke. You could sort of take this one along with Piotr. How, obviously, Luke, you used to be Moscow correspondent for The Guardian. How difficult is it for ordinary Russians to access the truth? I mean, Piotr, you sort of talked about this a bit earlier, but you know, that sort of sense of misinformation must be really kind of really sort of key and pivotal right now to the sort of war effort in Moscow.
I mean, just to begin, when I was in Moscow, which was between 2007 and 2011, when I was pushed out of the country by the FSB, you know, back then Russia was, I would say, a kind of semi-authoritarian state, but with vestiges of independent media, with some pluralism, with a few opposition politicians like Boris Nemtsov, whom you could talk to and interview, with Alexei Navalny having a big following but being free. You know, arrested from time to time, but since then, as I mean, you know, Piotr and Irina know this perfectly well. It's really devolved into a tyranny. I mean, Russia's now essentially a totalitarian state, and I would actually argue it's become a sort of fascist state, intolerant of dissent, pursuing a kind of murderous war against Ukraine, where the goal is to basically exterminate the idea of Ukraine and Ukrainians as well, and to kind of reclaim it for Russia. So I think it's very hard for most Russians to access decent information. There's also a kind of psychological problem as well. I mean, certainly, you know, Russian friends I used to have, I can no longer talk to because the differences over the war and what's happening there are so huge. Russian propaganda is massive, it's very effective. And I don't know if Piotr and Irina agree, but I would say most Russians are broadly supportive of the war, even if they don't follow it day for day, but that loosely, you know, they support.
Yeah,
Piotr, go ahead.
I'll jump in. Yeah, first of all, I'd like to say that you know, I think the Prigozhin mutiny really exposed how hard it is for the world to really get a good picture of what's going on in Russia. Obviously, all Russian independent journalists had to flee the country. Some have been jailed. Most of us foreign correspondents had to leave the country. You know, my best friend Evan Gershkovich, the journalist at the Wall Street Journal, he was one of the few who was still reporting from within the country, and he got jailed. He spent over 100 days in jail. So it's, you know, it's getting harder and harder for you know, the whole world to really get a good picture of what's going on in the country, and for us to do our job. For the average Russian, you know, every single independent outlet is blocked. You know, VPNs are on the rise. If you look at the most downloaded apps, it's on the Apple Store, it's always VPNs. So there is obviously some hunger for free information, but the majority, for different reasons, also psychological, you know, not wanting to know what's really going on, protecting themselves, building a shield around them, they don't actively look for that news, because if you do want to access independent news, you have to make an effort. You know, you have to get in a VPN, you have to subscribe. So yeah, I think the information barrier is huge. Ironically, some of the most critical information about the war and about the government we get from Telegram channels that are more right-wing and more extreme online. So they're the ones that some of them were supporting of Prigozhin. You know, they're the ones criticizing the Putin regime for not being pro-war enough, or for not mobilizing. So normal Russians do read those things, and I think that's why they also get affected and sometimes have sympathies with Prigozhin, because they have access to those Telegram channels. Yeah, so I think I think it's our job to keep on reporting on Russia for the Russians, but it's definitely not easy for them to get access, and many choose not to.
Thanks, Piotr. It's a very powerful and important point to make. So thank you for making it. Irina, if I can direct a question from Norman to you. He asks, is there any sense that tension within the Russian elite has had an impact on the morale of Russian troops fighting on the front line? That's from Norman Lamb.
Was a question that I missed because of the poor connection. Sorry, could you please repeat it?
Sorry, let me repeat. So is there any sense that tension within the Russian elite has had an impact on the morale of Russian troops fighting on the front line? The kind of, you know, the tension and the fractures within the elite?
No, I don't have any sense that the tensions inside the Russian elite affected heavily on the morale of in the Russian army, because the morale of the Russian army is traditionally low. It doesn't mean they can't fight. They can, but it's they have a low morale and they're still fighting. That's how it is in the Russian army. So I don't have any feelings that what happened affected heavily on the Russian army. It is a long conversation, but the Russian army is so specific and so unlike all the Western armies that you can't even compare them with the Russian army. So all the rules are different. What's going on inside, the hierarchy and relationship between officers and soldiers and between the officers themselves, they're absolutely different. And according by Western standards, it means low morale, a lot of violence, not a lot of initiative, but it doesn't mean that it is extremely weak and not capable to fight.
Thank you. Piotr, did you want to?
Yeah, no, I largely agree with Irina, but I do think, obviously, if we see a new breakthrough by the Ukrainian army, events like the Prigozhin mutiny will have an impact. They've created instability. They created some sort of chaos. It was temporary, but it did. And I think, in the end, it's up to Ukraine. And if Ukraine is able to push for a successful counteroffensive, I think the morale can have an impact on the actual fighting. And then we could see more mass desertions and also more tensions within the Russian elite. But I think events like Prigozhin's mutiny sort of add to it. They're not the one that will have the decisive impact on the war, but it's definitely one of those moments that I think we'll look back in history that it was maybe a start of a larger trend.
Thank you, Piotr. I'm just going to squeeze in one more question because we are getting close to our finish time, sadly. But another member of the audience asks, and this almost feels like quite a good question to sort of end our discussion on, given the subject of tonight's talk. Is Yevgeny Prigozhin still alive? I mean, he's not in Belarus. We are told he's in St. Petersburg. So I'm actually going to just ask all three of you for your view on this, if you're able to give a very quick synopsis of what you think. So Luke, over to you first.
I think Prigozhin is definitely alive for now, but the question, we were debating this in the green room before curtain up. Will he still be alive in 12 months' time? I find it hard to think that there can be a universe where Putin and Prigozhin can coexist forever. So I'll say yes for now, but 12 months, I think, big question mark.
Thanks, Luke. Irina?
I think he will be fine for the next 6 months, and I can't predict what's going on further. Just don't know.
Thank you. And Piotr?
Yeah, I think he is alive. I mean, we've heard an audio from him that came out yesterday or 2 days ago, latest one. Whether he's alive in a year, it's impossible to say. But as long as he's alive, he'll always be a stain on Putin's power. That's for sure.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody. So sadly, we've run out of time now, but I do hope we were able to answer some of your questions. So thank you so much to our panel, Piotr, Irina, and Luke. And thank you all for joining us tonight. And I do apologize again for the technical difficulties we had. You can read more of our reporting on Russia and the invasion of Ukraine at theguardian.com. We would really love to hear what you thought of this event. So please do fill out our survey at the end. Finally, a huge thanks again to our panel and to you for watching. Good night.